Thanks to Anil for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here this President's Day. Happy President's Day. The first U.S. president to live in the White House was the second U.S. president. It was John Adams. John Adams moved into the White House in November of the year 1800. Before that, while he was president, but before he moved into the White House, before the White House was complete, John Adams lived in Philly. Both John Adams, the nation's second president, and George Washington, the nation's first president, they both lived in Philadelphia in the 1790s while the U.S. Capitol and the White House were being built in D.C. And that house in Philadelphia, where both George Washington and John Adams lived while they each served as president, that house has a really interesting story. Accidentally, the last remaining walls of that house were, by accident, torn down in the 1950s. That was the last standing portion of the house. It was accidentally demolished in the 1950s. Decades later, once archaeologists and historians figured out for sure where that president's house had been, the city got involved. They bought the land, they preserved everything they could, and ultimately that site was reopened as a National Historic Site. Today it is sort of an open-air pavilion where you can see the shape of the president's house. You can see the foundations of the original building. They've got artifacts there from the time that George Washington and John Adams lived in that house. And while John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, while Adams was not a slaveholder, George Washington was. George Washington had 8 people who were enslaved to him, who he brought from Virginia to that house in Philadelphia to serve him while he was president. He later brought an additional enslaved person from Virginia to Philadelphia to that house, making it a total of 9. And that is all part of the history there at this historic site in Philadelphia. Now, you probably heard about the fact that over this past year, President Donald Trump ordered the physical removal of all references to slaves and slavery at that National Historic Site. Well, today, a big change in that case. Today, happy President's Day, a federal judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ordered that the Trump administration must put those references to slaves and slavery back up. The judge in the case is a Republican appointee from the George W. Bush administration, and she starts her remarkable ruling today with a quote from 1984 from George Orwell. She then says, quote, "As if the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984 now existed with its motto, 'Ignorance is strength,' this court is now asked to determine whether the federal government has the power it claims to dissemble and disassemble historic truths when it has some domain over historical facts. It does not." Honestly, this is your President's Day present this year, this ruling. Let me give you a little bit more from it. The President's House, meaning that site in Philadelphia, represents the city of Philadelphia fulfilling an obligation to tell the truth, the whole complicated truth. Removal of the crucial interpretive materials there strips that site of that truth and deprives the public of educational opportunities designed to be free and accessible. The abrupt elimination of historically significant educational material at the site is like pulling pages out of a history book with a razor. Each person who visits the president's house in Philadelphia and does not learn of the realities of founding-era slavery receives a false account of this country's history. Worse yet, the judge says, worse yet, the potential of having the exhibits replaced by an alternative script, a plausible assumption at this time, would be an even more permanent rejection of the site's historical integrity. It would be, quote, irreparable. The city has met its burden to establish irreparable harm. The defendants, the Trump administration, for their part, raise only one argument for why an injunction in this case would be inequitable. They argue that there's a public interest in upholding the federal government's right to convey its preferred speech. Restoration of the president's house in Philadelphia does not infringe upon the government's free speech, nor is the government prevented from conveying whatever message it wants to send by wiping away the history of the greatest founding fathers' management of persons he held in bondage. President Washington's house would not merit designation as a historic site if Washington had not commanded the army that won the Revolutionary War. His presence presiding over the Constitutional Convention graced it with the gravitas and spirit necessary to the creation of our government's foundational document. Washington's restraint and modesty radiated strength and wisdom that defines the ideal chief executive to this day. The government can convey a different message without restraint elsewhere if it so pleases, but it cannot do so to the president's house, not until it follows the law and consults with the city. The motion for preliminary injunction will be granted. Happy President's Day, Philadelphia. You are getting your history put back up by court order at the president's house. A lot of stuff is happening all at once this week. I think it's kind of just an accident of the calendar, but it's all happening all in a very quick series of days this week. Today's President's Day. Tomorrow is Lunar New Year. The year of the fire horse begins with this Lunar New Year. Ramadan starts tomorrow as well. Also, this week is Ash Wednesday, which is the start of Lent in the Christian calendar, which is the period leading up to Christianity's holiest day, which is Easter. I will also note, and this isn't a religious observance, it's a civil observance in the United States. But this week also happens to be when we have Remembrance Day for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Over 125,000 people locked up in prison camps in this country during World War II. American citizens and non-citizens alike locked up purely on the basis of their race. It was an executive order from President Roosevelt that enabled that to happen. That executive order was signed by FDR on February 19th, 1942. And so February 19th every year is Remembrance Day for that wildly unconstitutional and unwise decision to lock up whole families, to lock up men, women, children, elderly people, babies, lock them all up, all without trial for years in mass prison camps purely because of their race. That's all that Remembrance Day and all those other holidays and observances are all this week. And the last two things I mentioned there, the Remembrance Day for Japanese American incarceration in World War II and Ash Wednesday on the Christian calendar, those two things are sort of coming together this week in a way that I think is going to be a pretty big deal in the Chicago area. It's going to happen this Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, this week. The cardinal who leads the Archdiocese of Chicago, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, is this week on Wednesday going to lead an outdoor mass in Melrose Park, Illinois. They are expecting literally thousands of people to attend. And this service is specifically to basically stand up with both feet and to have the Catholic Church in America say, our church is a church of immigrants. It is a stand with immigrants observation. It's going to be Wednesday evening, interestingly. It's going to culminate in a procession through the streets. Again, thousands of people are expected. But a couple things to know about this. I mean, first of all, this is just a couple of miles from the immigrant prison, the ICE detention facility in Broadview, Illinois. And second, a federal judge has just ruled that Catholic clergy must be allowed into that ICE facility to offer Holy Communion, to offer ashes for Ash Wednesday to people who are locked up there by the Trump administration. ICE has just been ordered they need to let in the Catholic clergy to provide religious services to the people locked up there by court order, and they need to do it by Wednesday. Is the Trump administration going to allow that to happen? At that very same facility, at Broadview, for years, nuns and priests have been allowed in there to hold mass, to minister to the people who are locked up there. They've been allowed to do that for more than a decade before this past fall in September, the Trump administration put a stop to it. You might remember our footage that we aired here on this show, the dramatic footage of the Catholics' Eucharistic procession to Broadview in October this year. It's just right after the Trump administration started turning away the Catholic clergy and blocking them from providing religious services, even though they'd previously been allowed in there to do that for more than a decade. I love how the Trump administration Republicans like to crow about how they're all for religious freedom. They're the ones who turned away the nuns and the priests in Broadview after letting them in there for a decade. It was the Trump administration that turned them back. Well, now this week, a judge has ruled that those nuns and priests must be allowed back in. And so on that day, on the day they must be let in, on Wednesday this week, day after tomorrow, there's going to be a cardinal and several thousand Catholics and immigrant families and supporters of immigrants from all over Chicagoland, all in the streets, celebrating a huge outdoor mass, marking one of the holiest days of the year in the Christian calendar, and making what is effectively a big physical show of moral force on the side of immigrants, a peaceful moral confrontation with this government, with what they're doing with these attacks on immigrants and with their prison sites. So again, I think that's going to be a big deal. That is Wednesday this week. And while that is going to happen in a couple of days, there's also just a ton of news to report about other confrontations sort of this type, other confrontations, other opposition that's being stood up against Trump right now, and how those things are starting to pay off all over the country. So let's start tonight in Hutchins, Texas, which is just outside Dallas. Hutchins, Texas is one of the places where they've been trying to put a huge new Trump prison camp. Well, tonight, Hutchins has its regularly scheduled city council meeting. Local news stations in the Dallas area were planning to send camera crews and reporters to this city council meeting in Hutchins because they were expecting another fiery night of protest and anger and emotional opposition to this prison camp that Trump was trying to put up in this Texas town. You might remember our previous coverage of how up in arms everybody was in this town in Texas, saying they did not want one of these prison camps there.